Good morning and welcome, Trinity friends, to this new adult formation series. We're so excited that you're with us today, and we're even more excited about our conversation partner and collaborator and our topic. With Dr. Elizabeth Colton, we will be exploring public diplomacy, an everyday toolbox for the church and you. Now, we all know Liz from Trinity because she's been such a long time member of Trinity. She's on our vestry, and so she's no stranger to us at all. You've done a number of adult formation series, but for those who don't know, and for those who maybe are new to Trinity or just coming to us here on our YouTube station, you've got a long list of experiences and accolades, although I know you wouldn't call them that. But just to give everybody else a little bit of background on you, Liz has been all over the world in all different kinds of capacity. She has been a journalist covering hard-hitting news in wartime all over the world. She's been a diplomat all over the world. She's worked with the UN and the Foreign Service and the Peace Corps. She has done just about everything you could possibly do in her position to make this world a better place. And we are so lucky and thankful that she's a member of this community to be able to share some of her wisdom and expertise with us about public diplomacy and how it applies to us. You know, for we in layman's terms or layperson's terms, diplomacy sounds like something really fancy people do at the UN, but you've got a slightly different message for us, and you're going to help us explore what this looks like on the ground for us. Am I right or am I wrong?
That's right. Absolutely. That's correct.
Well, give us the lay of the land, Liz, about this idea of public diplomacy. And over the next 3 weeks in June, we're going to be exploring these different things with Liz in conversation with both myself and with our rector, the Reverend Dr. Scott White.
Thank you so much, David, Reverend David Henson.
Yeah.
And what I want to say at the beginning is I'm going to be talking about public diplomacy. I'm going to today introduce the concepts of public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, citizen diplomacy. Some of you have heard me talk about this before, but today we're going to be discussing it and over the next 3 weeks in a different way. And so let me just give a layout or plan for what we're going to do. Today, I'm going to discuss the concepts, the toolbox of public diplomacy tools and techniques, and the strategy for both designing and implementing a public diplomacy or diplomacy campaign or initiative that you can do, the church can do. And of course, I would say my ideal and our ideal is that it should all be for the good, for good causes in society, your own or others. Next week, I'm going to discuss an aspect of this with our own rector, our minister, the Reverend Dr. Scott White. And the following week, then Reverend David Henson and I are going to be discussing another aspect of this. And so we're going to really be having conversations. And I hope that all of you will, though you're not, in the conversation per se, you are really in the conversation. And we expect that you will be having questions and think about what we're doing. So,
one of the things that always amazes me about things that you've shared with me is that you really do emphasize with folks that everybody can be a diplomat. And I know you've talked about that some, but I just think that can't be emphasized enough when we talk about being a diplomat, that we can do that right there in our own lives, in our own neighborhoods, even in the midst of a pandemic.
Absolutely, even maybe more so. And I would add 2 things to that, David. If you think about it, if you go all the way back to of course, to the Bible and to the New Testament and to St. Paul in the Acts, you're talking about Christians being ambassadors. And so the word ambassador or diplomat has been used for a very long time to tell regular people, not just official fancy, as you say, fancy diplomats, that they're the diplomats. So I used to teach, when I started teaching a long time ago about diplomacy and the media, I started out by asking my students, what do you think of a diplomat? So we got people's stereotypical views. And of course, the stereotypical views are, well, it's someone fancy, well-dressed, secret, everything is secret. And that we only know about it.
The image of somebody carrying around a diplomatic pouch that nobody has access to, because we've all watched the spy movies, so, but you help demystify that for us. You open up that diplomatic pouch and show that it's a toolbox for us.
That's right. So let me introduce first the concepts, and then we'll go into the tools and techniques, the toolbox. The number one, if you think of the word diplomacy, I have a dictionary, of a diplomat's dictionary by a friend of mine, a retired ambassador, Chaz Freeman. And there may be 20 or 25 pages just of definitions by many people all over the world in history who have defined diplomacy in many, many ways. So the point is that diplomacy, and I will put out my own idea of it as it's a way of working ideally to bring about peace in the world. And now, when you work as a diplomat, you find that you're also, if you're working for a country, you're working for that country to promote its policy and to promote its position. If you think of international organizations, UN organizations, UNICEF or World Health or whatever, you are working for an international body, and you're supposed to be working sort of for the good of the world. So the idea is ultimately is to be working for peace, but of course that doesn't exclude for diplomacy. Diplomacy is not separate from military policy as well, because diplomacy in sort of real politics, of course, certainly would have armed strength behind it. To try to bring about peace or to good relations with between one country and another. The idea of public diplomacy, however, is a concept, or as being called that, is actually fairly new, fairly recent in the 20th century, that we started talking about public diplomacy. In other words, what we're talking to the press, to the media, putting diplomatic messages out in public. And for a long time, and it still is sometimes, is treated like a stepchild of diplomacy, because diplomacy, by certain diplomats might say, well, it's a very high level. We can't talk to the media. We can't get the word out. But as anyone knows, following the news, this has changed over time. But I would add that, and a related concept and a related kind of diplomacy is cultural diplomacy. And cultural diplomacy is actually using, anything of cultural, of human culture or our natural culture. It can be environmental diplomacy, it can be sports diplomacy, it could be food diplomacy, it can be dance diplomacy, literary diplomacy, anything where you use something to reach out to other people and to bring about better relations. So public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy, in fact, though they were sort of considered stepchildren and not very important for a long time, in fact, if you think about it, these were the first kinds of diplomacy. If you think of human beings, in the very beginning of human beings, when they had to reach out to another culture, they would invite them maybe to come eat with them. And that was a form of food diplomacy. Of course, the great risk in sitting down to eat with someone, because you might be poisoned. So if you think about it, it was the reaching out, the having meetings, and also giving talks. For example, one person would go as a diplomat and give a talk to another group. So it's bringing groups together. So
So a lot of things are kind of going through my head. There's so many connections to our world as citizens, not of kingdoms of this world, but as citizens of God's kingdom,
Mhm.
and how we are ambassadors in the midst of that, and diplomats. There's a
Absolutely.
word that floats around in kind of theological circles about public theologians. And this idea, there's a lot of resonance there, that the idea that, yes, we may have some kind of specialized training, but you are speaking in the public sphere and to the public in a way to bring about change and peace, and lifting up the values of God's kingdom. You know, even in sports, I mean, both in terms of kind of diplomacy in our world, and also kind of, we would call it almost evangelism in some cases, I suppose.
Well,
Um,
reaching out, and that's what that word means. And so the diplomacy, so then the idea, if you go back to the concept of diplomacy, that you have a plan or a policy, or you have the foreign policy of a country. So the diplomacy is the mechanism by which you promote your foreign policy, or, and of course, if it's world policy or church policy, or if it's, and I'm speaking, I'm taking the concept now of citizen diplomacy. And what I would like, and many of you know that I have encouraged you all before, is, you know, what are your own small, you might think they're small causes, but how would you like to get your own idea of art for peace out into the world? And so what we're going to be talking about the next 3 weeks is, I hope, will help each of you have ideas of how you can get your own causes out. Now, I would add, and it's very important to realize, just to give you an idea of how important citizens can be for diplomacy. If you think of, there was an initiative against landmines, and this was started by a woman in New England. And she basically started it out of her kitchen. And this was really before social media and everything. And it built and built and built literally all over the world, so that there's now anti-landmine legislation at the global level and national levels. And she and the anti-landmine people won the Nobel Peace Prize. There's also the woman in Kenya who started planting trees. And she was just, and I know the place in Kenya where she was. That's where I used to teach as a Peace Corps volunteer. She started planting trees and then started talking about, Wangari Maathai was her name, and she started talking about the value of citizens doing this for the environment, for the world. And she ended up winning a Nobel Peace Prize. So these are really not far-fetched to think of the value of which anybody can offer, and therefore you are working as a citizen diplomat. And I would add, you know, that of course people who are professional diplomats have traditionally sort of, maybe many of them, not all, have looked down on this idea because they wanted to keep it in an elite sort of sphere. But I think more and more people recognize that each person can think of themselves as a diplomat in their society, and then ideally reaching out to the world. So that's introducing those concepts, and then I'll talk a little about the tools and techniques. But David, did you have any other thing about that?
Yeah, no, there's so much I'd love to kind of dive into, and I know we only have, you know, a limited amount of time today, because we do want everybody to go worship after this. But we could probably talk for hours, you and I, about this. But the word you kept using is reaching out. And I thought about how in our particular moment in our world, with everything so profoundly polarized, reaching out is something that we don't actually see a lot of, particularly reaching out across difference. And how do you begin to develop those values, redevelop those values? You know, you think about the old stories about our politicians who could set aside their differences and have dinner together, or things of that nature. You know, those
Well, of course, that's diplomacy. Sit down and have dinner together.
But
yeah.
You know, what do we need to get to that point to be able to value reaching out again, I feel like that's so hard for us these days.
Well, let me talk about some of the tools and techniques that sort of segues into that in a way. If you then think of your diplomacy as you're trying to promote something, and again, I should add that there's always a danger of public diplomacy sliding into being propaganda, and that's not what you want. So I'm thinking of the ideal kind of public diplomacy for good purposes, or for national purposes if they are for peace. But so I acknowledge there's that danger, but we're not talking about that. We're not talking about the propaganda we're aiming, because propaganda is something that's not truthful, for example.
And we're hoping that the folks watching this, our fellow Trinitarians are not watching this to figure out how to do some propaganda for us. I assume that all of us as Trinitarians, we're citizens of God's kingdom. So we've got those values, and that's really whatever we're promoting, that's what's underneath all of it, right? Those right. Values of God's kingdom.
Well, I bring it up only because somebody could argue, this is right. Propaganda. So I'm saying I'm not on that.
Right, right.
But the point is that in your diplomacy, in your diplomatic initiative, one is trying to get out a message. You have a goal to get the message. Now you may have a central message, and then whatever it is, let's say to use art for peace. For example, and we have a lot of artists in our community, and I'm using that as a sample that's not religious per se, or not necessarily, it can be countries or international organizations use art all the time for art diplomacy. I'm using that. So let's say you have a message and you want to get it out, and then there are going to be smaller messages within those messages, but they're all dovetailed. Then how do you start getting them out? And so let me first just name a number of the tools and techniques that are used in public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy. And these tools, which are public diplomacy tools. Number one, the first and most traditional, if you think of it, and basic human one, is giving a speech. And that speech has a message. And so when either within a society or to another society, you give a speech, you give a talk. And then, so that is your first tool. And as I'm listing these tools, and then I'm going to discuss how you then have to plan how to bring them in. When is the most appropriate time to use which tool? So you also have speech, you have cultural and educational exchanges. For example, okay, how do we interact? We tell people about our culture. We tell people about our education. We share, we train. We have training programs. Training is a big and major tool for public diplomacy. You have seminars that brings people together. Of course, it was that we bring people in the same room. Now we're trying to bring people together with Zoom or, video conferencing. We have conferences. We bring people together, either virtually now or in person. We put on exhibitions. Exhibitions are another, you have a big exhibit and you put out your messages. And of course, this was done a great deal during the Cold War. Big exhibitions would say that we believe in the freedoms, the First Amendment rights, etc. Put that out all over Eastern Europe and out to the whole world. We also have, in diplomacy, you have missions. Missions being, you send a group of people, of diplomats and maybe other people, to another place and talk about your message. Related to that are so-called sponsored visits. Those might be, for example, or the missions could be either a trade mission, for example, or a mission of artists, or a mission of dancers, or a mission of athletes. All of these, so those are ways to get the message out about your main message. You also use other tools, of course, are the press, the traditional press, since the printing press and books and pamphlets and papers, all of those, and the broadcast media, which of course, interestingly, is now considered a traditional
Right.
tool. The broadcast media, radio, television, and how to use all of that. And then another tool is actually managing relations with the media.
Mm.
So all of these are your tools at your fingertips. All of these I've mentioned: speech, cultural and educational exchanges, training, conferences, seminars, exhibitions, missions, sponsored visits, press and broadcast television, radio, media, and managing the relations.
There are so many overlaps I hear you talking about, even in some of the verbiage about the language and the emphasis in the church. So, and I don't want to steal the thunder of the next two sessions that we're going to have in June here, but I can't wait to begin to explore some of those connections, because I think your expertise and wisdom in that, combined with kind of where the church is going and where the church has been, can be really fruitful and empowering for our people. I think one of the hard things about this moment, where we're more socially isolated or physically isolated than we have been, that it makes it difficult to think you actually can make a difference, or you can be active in doing something in the world sometimes. But what I hear you saying is that with these kind of basic tools of diplomacy, wherever you are and in whatever situation you find yourself, you can begin that work of making change in the world, as our own mission statement says, to kind of expect and make a difference in the world, which is kind of what we're about here at Trinity, as you well know and have been a part of,
Right.
As part of Trinity. So I am excited about getting to explore this some more.
Well, and then of course, those were the traditional tools and techniques. And then we have the new tools, which are digital. And those are the social media, and it could be anything. It's Instagram or Zoom or Facebook or Twitter, or what's a Snapchat, whatever it is. So we have two kinds of sets of tools now available. Important thing when I'm teaching this, and it's still very true, and diplomats will recognize this, all of these technical tools or tools of broadcast media or the printing press or whatever, still there is the importance of the face-to-face. And right now we're having to have face-to-face virtually, but that's important. And it's that connection, sitting in my house all day long, I am literally talking either in Zoom or telephone or email or Facebook or Twitter. I am talking all the time with people, contacts around the world, and literally on 6 continents. And I've been teaching students on 6 continents. So we have this amazing opportunity right now. Since we're going to be short of time, let me just quickly, David, let me conclude the third aspect. So we have the idea of the concepts, which I've introduced. We've had the tools and techniques, which I've introduced. The third part of this is then, okay, so how do we use these? Just what you were talking about, David. This is where you have to recognize that you have actually, you at home, as citizen diplomats or the church or organizations or whatever, you have a toolbox. And that toolbox, what I've talked about, you have to become adept at using and flexible. I think Trinity Church has certainly demonstrated a huge flexibility and adaptability. That's important at jumping from one kind of toolbox to another. For example, this past Wednesday, the communion service, the Eucharist, we had Scott, our rector, Reverend Dr. Scott White. He was in the sanctuary and having the communion. David here, Reverend David Henson, had actually recorded. I don't know if it was live, David. It wasn't live, but
we're not telling people.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, he actually gave the homily, And it was a reflection on the day. It was the feast day of Saint Ephraim of Syria. And what was amazing was that Trinity was able to have this in the sanctuary, and then the reflection from David's own garden. It was really beautifully done. So the point being is that once you know you have this toolbox at your fingertips, you then need to become adept and flexible at using it. And maybe you need assistance, hiring or getting the assistance of a professional who helps you know how to do this. But I think it's valuable for everyone to know they can then come up with a diplomatic initiative and use the toolbox. So
what I've loved about Trinity is watching our parish adapt as well. Like so many of our people exactly. to kind of pivot and adapt and to begin to form community in this, way that wasn't even really on our radar 6 months ago.
Right.
And so I love this idea that the things that we're passionate about, that we value, that we want to put in the world, that we have that voice through these tools, through these toolboxes, and that we can not only lift up our voices, but we can also lift up other voices as well through those same toolbox. The other thing that strikes me is that so much of what you're talking about also can apply within families and interpersonal relationships about how we engage in diplomacy in our interpersonal relationships too, because
absolutely.
I think we've all had the experience of disagreeing with our family at some point in time. But so all in all, Liz, this sounds like something that is both will challenge us. It will engage us. It will introduce some new things to us, but it will also empower us. And it will also give us a sense that we can go forth into the world and proclaim the gospel in so many different ways, using these toolbox you're going to share with us and teach us about. So I'm thrilled about it, and I hope everyone will join us next week as we talk with the Reverend Dr. Scott White and Liz as they dive into some of those traditional tools of diplomacy and how that connects with our life as a church and our life here at Trinity. And I'm really excited about it. To be a part of that, to get to watch it, and to get to learn from both of you. So join us next week at 10 a.m. on YouTube, right here, same time, where Dr. Elizabeth Colton will be hanging out on Zoom with our own rector, Scott White. Liz, thank you so much for your time today, and we'll see everybody next week.
Great. Thank you. Looking forward to it.